The apartment hallway smelled like boiled cabbage, unwashed wool, and someone else's dinner. Always someone else's dinner. It was 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in Leningrad, 1977, and Galina Mikhailovna was 7 minutes late for her kitchen time. 7 minutes. Through the thin walls, she could already hear pots clanging, water running. Someone had taken her slot. Again. She stood there, holding a pot of raw chicken pieces that had cost her 3 hours in line and half a week's salary, watching the second hand on her wristwatch. At 7 p.m. exactly, she would walk into that kitchen. At 7 p.m. she would face whichever neighbor had stolen her time. And at 7 p.m. she would have to decide. Start a war that could last months in an apartment where 7 families shared one bathroom, one kitchen, and one fragile piece. Or let her children eat bread and tea for dinner. When Yuri Andropov moved into apartment 42 at 15 Rubinstein Street in 1953, he counted the nails in the hallway wall. 14 nails. 14 places where the previous tenants had hung their kitchen schedules, their bathroom rosters, their desperate attempts to organize chaos into something survivable. The mathematics seemed simple enough. 7 families, 1 kitchen, 24 hours in a day. Divided equally, each family gets roughly 3.5 hours. But life isn't mathematics. People work different shifts. Children need to eat before school. Some families have 1 person cooking. Others have 3 generations needing to prepare meals at different times. And then there's the stove itself. 4 burners, sometimes only 3 working, occasionally just 2. The kitchen schedule that hung by the door in apartment 42 wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a peace treaty, rewritten every few months after someone violated the terms. The schedule from 1956 still exists in a Moscow archive, a yellowed sheet covered in different handwriting, corrections, angry margin notes. Sokolov family consistently 15 minutes over limit, someone wrote in blue ink. Below it, in different handwriting, Petrova uses all hot water, leaves no consideration. Marina Vladimirovna learned the schedule before she learned her multiplication tables. She was 8 years old in 1974 when her family moved into their Kommunalka in Moscow, and her mother made her memorize everyone's cooking times within the first week. You have to know when to stay invisible, her mother told her, when to walk past the kitchen without looking in, when to hold your breath and count to 10 before entering. The Volkov family, 5:30 to 7 a.m., 4:30 to 6 p.m. Viktor Volkov worked the early shift at the textile factory, and his wife Svetlana needed the kitchen before the morning rush. They had 3 children under 10. Their time was sacred. The Romanov grandmother, 7 a.m. to 8:30 a.m., 12 to 1 p.m. She was 73, survived the siege of Leningrad, and nobody argued with her about kitchen time. And so it went. 7 families, their lives parsed into 30-minute and hour-long segments, their hunger organized into rotating shifts of survival. But here's what the schedule couldn't account for: human nature. The Great Pot War of Apartment 63 in Sverdlovsk lasted 7 months in 1968. It started over a single pot, a good aluminum pot with a copper bottom, the kind that distributed heat evenly and didn't burn kasha. Ludmila Sergeyevna bought it after standing in line for 4 hours. She used it exactly twice. The third time she reached for her pot, stored in her designated cabinet space, it was gone. In its place, a dented, scorched thing that barely qualified as a cooking vessel. Someone had switched them. She knew who. Everyone knew who. The Karpov family in room 3 had been eyeing that pot since she brought it home. But knowing and proving are different things. especially when accusing your neighbor might mean living in open warfare in an apartment where you share a bathroom. For 7 months, Ludmila cooked with the terrible pot. She never got her good one back, but she won in other ways. The Karpovs needed to borrow salt one evening when stores were closed. Ludmila's cabinet was suddenly empty. The Karpovs asked to switch kitchen times for a family birthday. Ludmila's schedule was inflexible. Every tiny daily interaction became a battlefield. And in a Kommunalka, there were dozens of interactions every single day. Anatoly Ivanovich, who lived through 32 years in a Leningrad Kommunalka, described it in a 1995 interview. "We weren't enemies, you understand. We helped each other through illnesses, watched each other's children, mourned each other's dead. But we also fought over a centimeter of shelf space like it was the border between nations." Both things were true. Both things were always true. The paradox of Kommunalka life was this: the closer people lived, the more intensely they could hate each other. And yet, they were also bound together in ways that made them family. You couldn't divorce your Kommunalka neighbors. You couldn't move unless the state assigned you different housing, which could take decades. So, you learned to exist in a constant state of negotiated hostility and forced intimacy. The Kommunalka wasn't designed for 7 families. It was designed for one, usually a wealthy merchant or minor aristocrat before the revolution. The apartment at 22 Fontanka Embankment in St. Petersburg was built in 1901 for a family of 4, plus servants. It had high ceilings, ornate molding, parquet floors. 140 square meters of pre-revolutionary bourgeois comfort. By 1925, it housed 43 people in 7 family units. The transformation happened quickly after 1917. The Bolsheviks had a housing crisis and an ideology that demanded equal distribution of space. The concept was called upletnение, compaction. Why should one family occupy an entire apartment when working-class families were living in barracks? The original dining room became Room 1, home to the Belov family, husband, wife, 3 children, wife's mother. 14 square meters for 6 people. They hung curtains to create sleeping zones. Parents behind one curtain, grandmother behind another, 3 children sharing the remaining space. But here's what foreigners never understood about kommunalkas. The walls had ears, but they also had gaps. Not metaphorical gaps, actual physical gaps. The partitions erected to divide rooms rarely reached the ceiling. Sound traveled up and over, through and around. Privacy wasn't a right in the Kommunalka. It was an elaborate fiction everyone agreed to maintain. Oksana Dmitrievna, who grew up in a Moscow Kommunalka in the 1960s, remembered, "I learned to identify every family by their sounds. The Grishins fought every Saturday night after the husband drank. The Morozov baby cried at 2 a.m. like clockwork. The Lebedev grandfather coughed this terrible wet cough that you could hear through 3 walls. And the Petrov couple, well, we knew when they were being intimate because their bed squeaked against the shared wall. Everyone knew. Everyone pretended not to know. That was the bargain." The bathroom deserves its own mention. 1 bathroom, 1 toilet, sometimes a tub, sometimes just a sink and a communal shower schedule. The unwritten rule? 10 minutes maximum, unless it was your designated bath time. When someone exceeded their time, the knocking would start. Polite at first, 1 knock, then more insistent, then the passive-aggressive commentary through the door. "Some of us have to get to work, you know." Sugar disappeared first. Always the sugar, then salt, then butter, if you are careless enough to leave it in the communal refrigerator. In Kommunalkas, lucky enough to have 1 refrigerator for 7 families. The theft economy in Kommunalkas operated on its own twisted logic. Nobody stole big things because big things were noticeable. But small things? a few spoonfuls of sugar, 1 egg from a half dozen, a piece of soap shaved down over weeks. These were the invisible transfers of wealth that happened in every shared kitchen in every Soviet city. Tatyana Petrovna developed her system in 1971. She marked her eggs with a pencil, a tiny T on each one. When one went missing, she knew. When 2 went missing, she knew exactly who took them because she'd noticed which family was frying eggs during a time they shouldn't have had any. But here's the dilemma. What do you do with that knowledge? Confront them and start a war over 2 eggs? Let it go and invite more theft? The answer usually was to steal something back. Not the same thing, that was too obvious, but something of equivalent value. The Kommunalka economy balanced itself through this constant, unspoken exchange of petty theft and counter-theft. Every family had their hiding places. Food couldn't just be stored in assigned cabinets. Too vulnerable. Natasha Leonidovna kept her tea in a locked box under her bed. The Markov family kept their good cooking oil in a jar hidden behind their wardrobe. One woman, Irina Vladimirovna, lost her hiding place in the worst possible way. She died suddenly of a heart attack in 1983, and her family discovered she'd been hoarding 27 bars of soap, 14 packages of tea, 6 jars of Hungarian jam, and 3 kilograms of sugar behind a false panel in her wardrobe. She'd been collecting for years, stealing a little here and there, hiding it away. When her family discovered it during the funeral preparations, they couldn't even be angry. They just divided it up and said nothing. Everyone understood. At 5:17 a.m., before the sun came up over Moscow in winter, Ludmila Vasilyevna was already in the kitchen. Her time didn't officially start until 5:30, but she'd learned to arrive early, to have the water already boiling when the clock hit her slot, to maximize every minute. She had 13 minutes to make breakfast for 4 people. Kasha was already prepared the night before. Black bread, sliced thin to make it last. Tea, weak but hot. Her husband needed to eat by 5:55 to catch the tram to the factory. Her son needed to eat by 6:10 to walk to school. This was the daily mathematics of being a woman in a Soviet Kommunalka. Add up all the minutes, subtract sleep, divide what remains between work, family, shopping, cooking, cleaning, and the emotional labor of maintaining peace with 7 families' worth of neighbors who could make your life hell if you gave them reason. Olga Mikhailovna, who lived in Kommunalkas for 35 years, calculated once. Between shopping, cooking, cleaning, and managing the household, I spent approximately 47 hours per week on domestic labor. I also worked a full-time job, 43 hours per week at the garment factory. That's 90 hours per week. My husband worked his job. That's all he did, 43 hours. The Soviet Union told us women were equal. And in the factory, maybe we were. But in the Kommunalka, we carried everything. And then there was the shopping. Western visitors to the Soviet Union never fully understood this. Shopping wasn't something you did once a week. Shopping was a part-time job, an endurance test, a skill that separated the merely surviving from the actually feeding their families. Elena Igorevna described the system. You had to know which stores got deliveries on which days. The bread factory delivered to the store on Kirov Street Tuesday and Friday mornings. Milk came Wednesday afternoon. Good sausage, when it existed, appeared at the store near the train station,
But you'd never know when, so you had to check every day. And if you saw a line forming, you joined it even if you didn't know what they were selling, because lines meant something good had arrived. The shopping bag, the avoska, named from maybe, because maybe you'd find something to put in it, was every woman's constant companion. Marina Vladimirovna remembered, "I saw my mother cry exactly twice in my childhood. Once when my grandmother died, once when she stood in line for 2 hours and 30 minutes for butter, and when she finally reached the front, the woman behind the counter said they were out. Just out. All that time for nothing."
New Year's Eve, 1982. Apartment 17, Gorky Street, Moscow. For one night, just one night, the kitchen wars stopped. The Volkov family brought their homemade pelmeni, dough rolled thin as paper. The Morozov grandmother contributed her precious jarred mushrooms, picked the previous autumn. The Belov family somehow procured a bottle of real Georgian wine. The newlywed Kozlovs brought their youth and energy, stringing up decorations made from newspaper. At 11 p.m., someone suggested they all eat together. Not in shifts, not divided by family. Together. Rule 1. Though nobody ever wrote it down, you never, ever repeated what you overheard through the walls. In a Kommunalka, you heard everything. Arguments, confessions, intimate moments, political conversations that could be dangerous. You heard it all, and you acted like you heard nothing. Rule 2. Children were neutral territory. No matter how bitter the feud between families, you didn't take it out on children. When young Misha Volkov fell and broke his arm in 1978, Mr. Sokolov, who had been feuding with the Volkov family for 8 months over bathroom violations, picked up the boy, carried him 3 blocks to the clinic, and stayed with him until his mother could be found. The feud continued afterward, but that moment existed outside it. Rule 3. Death and illness created temporary truces. When someone died or fell seriously ill, all disputes paused. Food was shared. Kitchen schedules became flexible. The period of truce typically lasted 3 days after a death, 1 day after a serious illness was announced. After that, normal hostilities could resume. Rule 4. You never went to outside authorities unless you wanted to be exiled from the social structure of the apartment. Calling the police over a Kommunalka dispute marked you as someone who couldn't handle their own problems. You became untouchable after that, but not in a good way. Rule 5. You could hate your Kommunalka neighbors, but you defended them fiercely against outsiders. Someone from another apartment complaining about noise? You stood together, all 7 families, denying everything. The Kommunalka was your prison, but it was your prison, and solidarity against external threats was absolute. Galina Mikhailovna, the woman from our opening, eventually moved from her Kommunalka in 1993. She got her own apartment, small, far from the city center, but hers. When asked about those years in the shared apartment, she doesn't give a simple answer. Did I hate it? Yes, every day. The stolen time, the constant fighting, the smell of other people's lives in my nose every moment. I hated it. Do I miss it? Sometimes. And I hate that I miss it. I miss knowing I wasn't alone. I miss the Volkov children growing up before my eyes. I miss the way the Morozov grandmother made tea. I even miss the fights, a little, because at least they meant people cared enough to fight. The Kommunalka taught me that human beings can survive almost anything, and also that survival isn't always enough, and also that sometimes it has to be.
She pauses, looking out the window of her private apartment, her own kitchen visible behind her, small, cramped by Western standards, but gloriously, completely, wonderfully hers. I wouldn't go back. Not for anything. But those years made me who I am. For better and worse, mostly worse, but also not only worse. That's the truth nobody wants to hear about the Kommunalka. It was terrible, and it was also life. Real life, with all its contradictions. And we lived it. The last Kommunalkas are disappearing now, converted to private apartments, demolished, or simply emptying as residents die and aren't replaced. In another generation, they'll exist only in photographs and memories, and stories told by old people to young people who can't quite imagine it. But the lessons remain, about human resilience, about the price of privacy and the burden of proximity, about how people survive systems designed to break them. The Kommunalka was 7 families sharing one kitchen. It was scheduling your life in 15-minute increments. It was stolen sugar and borrowed solidarity. It was the worst of human pettiness and the best of human endurance, happening simultaneously in the same small space for decades. It was impossible, and millions of people did it anyway.